Well, welcome back, everybody. So good to be back with you, continuing this groundbreaking series on the Dead Sea Scrolls deception. This is now part 7. If you can believe it, we're already here, gone through so much incredible material. Today, we're getting into the Vatican and so much more. So very excited for this one, Michael. Good to see you as always.
Yeah. Well, thanks to members, part 7, that's what it's all about. But the idea is to take it apart slowly rather than all try to get everything down into sound bites. At the end of the day, I think this is a much better platform and a much better method of doing this, because these are huge. Even what we're going to touch on today, I've had to compress down a very large subject that's mostly to do with this 5th sect. At the very end, we're going to touch on something very important about the 4th sect that's really never been touched on by the people who brought that to light in the 80s and 90s. They left out something that's actually quite important, so important that it should be known to one and all, especially those who are interested in that mystery, the Merovingians, the bloodline families. And so we'll get to that at the end, but we wanted to look at another controversy that just shows how scurrilous this 5th sect that became papal Christianity, the Roman circle, is. And it starts off, if we go to the first slide, we can kick that off, because it all starts with this guy, Heinrich Schliemann, the German, who really is often considered the founder of archaeology. Now, of course, in those days, it was a sloppy affair. It wasn't anything that in later years would have been up to the level of the methodology and even the care. But it was kicked off. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the period that began it in earnest, at least for the modern age. But let's go back to that slide. Look at the date. It's not so much about the individuals as it is about the date. Can you read that for those who are not watching?
Yeah, so this is 1822 to 1890.
Now, this is very important. Let's go to the next slide and just keep an eye on those dates. This is the middle of the 19th century. And here, can you read those, David, please?
Yeah, Flenders Petri, who's 1853 to 1942. Charles Piazza Smythe, 1819 to 1900. And Howard Carter from 1874 to 1939.
Yeah, these are the guys, of course, that are the famous Egyptologists who were rock stars of their time. Pius IX, Flenders Petri was first on the scene at Jerusalem, and this kind of thing, and the famous Howard Carter, who opened up Tutankhamun. So we immediately see a picture, whether it's Schliemann or it's these fellows. You're talking about the 19th century, barely moving into the 20th. You're not even in the 20th century yet. But the thing is that this is fairly late in the day. I bet you a lot of people listening to us, and if the people listening to us went around and asked their friends, they think that archaeology is probably something, that's, hundreds and hundreds of years old. It's not. But let's go to the next one. Yeah, could you read that?
Sure. Flenders Petri, in the late 19th century, under the auspices of Queen Victoria and other British dignitaries, he was placed in charge of the project to excavate the foundations of the Temple of Jerusalem. Thus, the disciple of biblical archaeology was born. The remains of 11 separate cities were unearthed. Petri's work followed on from that of Charles Wilson, whose excavation at the site began in 1864.
Yeah. See, so he was one of the first. There was even an earlier attempt to dig it up, but this guy came in with the heavy guns. Queen Victoria personally, and some of the richest men. Now, in past programs, we've even shown who these richer men are, right? Who are the black nobility? They're the 4th sect. So here again, you have an odd connection that shows that they have an agent that they send out to start digging up the remains. All right, so the dates are important, but this is also an interesting anecdote. Who's actually sending Flinders Petri out to Jerusalem? Let's go on.
This guy's Ernest Renan or Renan?
Renan. Yeah.
Renan, 1823 to 1892.
Yeah, very important in our story. So he is now moving into the 20th century. You see how this works? So, well, nearly on the curve of that, just on the cusp, coming up to the. So it's still the 19th century. But anyway, let's read on. Ernest Rean plays a very, very big role in the story we're telling here. Go to the next one.
So Ernest Renan, in 1885, he renounced his position as priest and began questioning the legitimacy of Christianity. In 1860, after returning from an archaeological survey in Egypt, he published his controversial book, The Life of Jesus. The book argued that Jesus was not a divine being, simply a man. Because of Renan's illustrious and intellectual status, the book became an international bestseller.
Now, this is what really kicked off what we would call the myth of Jesus, the Jesus myth. It started with Renan in earnest because of the fact that the book was a bestseller and it shook up the world. It's hard for us to grasp this. And he was also an ex-priest. So the thing there, though, that's been emphasized, Petri goes out to Jerusalem, a famous center of Christianity. Renan also went on an archaeological survey to look into the roots of Christianity. It took him over to Egypt. But they were both archaeologists. So what do we say? What is the actual pattern here? That for the first time, we're getting what would be called scientists. Some people may insist that they were just proto-scientists, but that doesn't matter. These were the first scientists going out to check into the origins, what had been for thousands of years just taken purely on faith. Let's go on. Oh, yeah. And then, of course, let us not forget the pure science of it. What do we have here?
So you got Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882, Herbert Spencer, 1820 to 1903, and Thomas Huxley, 1825 to 1895.
So there you go. One of them is a 20th century character. So we're just, inching into the 20th century. But these are much more well-known than the people we just mentioned. These are the heavyweights of the new science, the Darwinian evolution, the origin of the species, right? The descent of man, which, of course, absolutely steamrolled in and became, till this day, the foundations of that bastion of modern science. So I'm just giving a context that all of this is happening at the same time. Think of the reaction in the Vatican to all of this. But let's go on. Again, just wanted to let you know those dates. This is a very, very important issue that's happening in the middle of the 19th century, inching toward the 20th. Oh, yeah.
Now we got Richard Wagner. He's 1813 to 1883.
Right. Now, it's not just in the sciences of archaeology and other things like that. It's also in the arts. Here's Richard Wagner, the great composer. Not really celebrating Christianity. The great German is jumping over that back to an earlier pagan tradition. And he's world famous. He's a master, right? But unlike Bach and Mozart and people like that, he is saying, I'm not turned on by Christian myths of Jesus, like say Bach had been, right? He is going over that back to the earlier Germanic folk traditions, the pagan tradition, and it's catching on like wildfire. Whether he's talking about the god cycle of the ancient, Teutonic deities, or he's talking about Parsifal, some sort of Grail legend, and all of that. These magnificent operas that he's doing and these symphonies. So here you have a new direction in the arts. I'm only mentioning one man here. It catches on. You suddenly get this whole romantic movement coming out of Germany. We have even the philosophers. Remember the romantic philosophers? Although they are nominally Christian, they're widening out things enormously. Going back to Plato, going back to the pagans and the Neoplatonists and Hermeticism. Look at Pico della Mirandola, look at Giordano Bruno. But here you have right up in the 19th and 20th centuries, another famous man, just one of many to come, who is now saying, yeah, Christianity, let's just, park that for now. I think that Parsifal is a far more interesting character. I think Siegfried is a sort of a Grail knight, a Christ-like messianic figure. What? Can you imagine what the Catholic Church is thinking at this time? So let's go ahead.
Giuseppe Maria Garibaldi, 1807 to 1882.
That's right. So Mazzini, we also have it in the revolutionaries of the time. They could care less about Christianity. Garibaldi took away all of the lands of the papacy in Italy. He left them a tiny little scrap. There was a head-on attack on their, this is not happening in a far off shore. This is not happening just in intellectual circles. They've got this rebel leader going crazy, and they come there and they invade the Vatican, right? And they take back all the papal states and leaving a tiny little quarter for the Pope to live in. It was one of the greatest threats, and it was a people's rising on the surface. It was a popular rising against them, led by this man. And he was the leader of Young Italy. We've talked about these groups before on our show that we did recently on the Islamo-communism. We showed that Giuseppe Mazzini and Garibaldi, they were friends, you see. They were one and the same. These are Illuminati. And they were rising all over the world. Young Ireland, could talk for hours on that subject. Young Italy. And these groups, the Young Turks, this is one we talked about on that program, Islamo-communism. People have no idea what's going on with that. So these forces were taken over. But one of their targets was the Papal States. And you can read all about it. We'll put a link below. And therefore, the threat was absolutely at their doorstep. They didn't know when they were going to be torn to pieces. And as far as the Vatican was concerned, they really already had been. This was like a, invasion, so to speak, under Garibaldi. But let's go on.
I was just noticing the dates also, 1882 in that region. That 1882 is when Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis, the Antediluvian World book, got published.
Really?
Yeah, I got it on my desk right now. I was like, oh, interesting.
And that is itself pivotal.
Yeah.
In the annals of catastrophism, So yeah, this was a people's rising that threatened their very existence, and they didn't know how they were going to push back at that.
Exactly. Now this is, oh my God, Pope Pius here, 1846 to 1878. With papal infallibility coming under attack from all sides, and particularly from the scientific world, Pope Pius, what's my Roman numerals? What is that? He's I can't remember.
12?
Yeah, anyway, 1792 to 1878, I think that's more important, decided it was imperative that the church actively resisted the new zeitgeist. Adversaries of the church were to be confronted on their own ground. Thus began the Catholic modernist movement, complete with its own cadre of academics and intellectuals versed in scientific methodologies. Their job was to use science to support the Bible rather than to refute it.
Look at that. Under this Pope the Ninth,
Ninth,
Pius
okay.
the Ninth actually has this idea that's gets a lot of traction at the time. Everything we've just looked at was the first idea to counter it was Pope Pius's idea. Of course, not him alone, but the Coteria, the Curia. They sit around and go, right, we will use the same science. So they hired some pretty clever, adept people from within the ranks to fight back at Schliemann, right, who kicked it off, and all these people we've just mentioned. They tried to fight fire with fire. They tried to say, we'll fight them on their own ground. Let's go on.
The project was doomed to failure. Those young clerics versed in science were more than likely to abandon their religion, as they came to realize how little factual verification for it existed. Close critical examination of the scriptures only served to reveal endless inconsistencies, discrepancies, and frauds. The dogma of the church was not strengthened, but grossly weakened by the efforts of the modernists. Consequently, there were many high-ranking defectors at this time.
There you go.